This is Vision 5, and the music which we have heard a small sample of was from Hildegard of Bingen, written about 800 years ago. There are many cassettes now of Hildegard's work. This was from Voice of the Blood, and we'll play some further examples of it after the break. Could we stop the camera for just a moment? Your ear, you will hear the sea. The vibration of the planet in its sea is in the shell all over the world. The vibration of truth is in the form, the structure of that which hears. And so someone who can use an ocean of language has but one prerequisite, that you hold the shell to your ear. Let's start again. Let's begin. We'll start all over. And if we need to, well, we can start again. This is Vision 5. We come today to a new pair of books. We're using books in pairs because the use of a single book has a preconditioned pattern which by now is archetypal and has formed our psyches to the extent that the world in which we live is already preconditioned to the book to such an extent that it has become ingrained as deep as a geological strata. The philosophic term of speaking from a book and elucidating its meaning is called exegesis. And the form of exegesis, when it becomes reductively reduced to a common denominator, such as education in the modern world, exegesis becomes a instructional quality which can only deliver to you enough complication to be able to turn the machine on and adjust its dials. A language which can reach that maturing, resonant quality of our focus, sometimes called the center, sometimes called the mind, occasionally labeled the soul, sometimes in great insight called the no-self. Perhaps easier to adjust our attention to is simply to designate it as a focus. That this focus is not a crosshairs of coordinates, but is an implosion of many vectors. And the ancient word which preceded exegesis was symbolon, symbol in Greek. And symbol meant thrown together, the center of meaning which comes from being thrown together, that all of the meaning is thrown together. It's imploded. And that place of implosion, that locus of implosion, was a point which had its own geometry. And in addition to being a locus, which was a point for geometry, it was also a focus for meaning. And that meaning was intimately related to the structure of the geometry of the locus, so that meaning distributed itself along the organizational lines of the geometry of place, so that the meaning of images was distributed in a form in the mind, and that this form in the mind was made up of a geometry of locus for an implosion process. In the 1930s in the United States, comic books used to have an image for the idea, a little thought bubble where the light bulb goes on. It's a very graphic, simple presentation of an ancient truth. That there is an illumination when meaning comes together. Light happens. Understanding in terms of visual illumination. And from this we get the very powerful idea of vision. That vision is a seeing, it's a comprehensive seeing. It's a seeing from within, which has a different kind of an ecology from a seeing without. When we see something external to us, two eyes must focus out there. But when we see within, we see in terms of resonances of wholeness. Vision is not looking at the pointedness of the external focus, but is accommodating this deep complementariness of an interior focus, which instantly distributes itself in terms of the geometry of the locus. And so when the ancient memory tradition wanted to have a little phrase, how does memory work? It works by, the Latin term was loci et foci. Focus and place. And if you make a structure of place, and you're able to carry a concentrated focus into that structure of place, you can distribute the meaning perfectly in an arrangement of imagery which is indelible. As long as the brain is able to hold the functioning of mind, memory will hold clearly that loci et foci. Once you have memorized a structure with deep concentration, that record is permanent. Permanent even to the extent that one can do it with enough concentration. The ancient word dhyana, meditation, concentration, enough implosive exactness, enough oomph, so that the distributed geometry of meaning, that memory, outstrips and outlives the physiological brain and can be accessed even after that particular physiological brain has ended its life cycle. Thus, there is a power of mnemonic that exceeds the limitations of nature. And so memory was always something above nature, something more than nature. The term quite frequently used was supernatural, but we should put the Latin supra in a more precise presentation, supranatural. And we've talked about how something supernatural or supranatural is in a regular language called transcendent. Belongs to a transcendental realm vis-a-vis nature. Thus, if we want to be specific, and we need to be specific sometimes, if we would like to be accurate, and accuracy quite frequently is a quality which is desirable, the accuracy and the specificity of designation is that memory is a transcendental form. That the geometry of meaning that becomes distributed into a mnemonic structure is able to hold its existence independent of nature. That natural ecology of time and space are no longer the controlling conditionals of a mnemonic structure. In traditional Buddhism, this is known as jhana, is a concentration, but it takes attentiveness. And when there's a teacher who is present, who is able to teach this, resonate there. All else is extraneous and shows ignorance. That this world is an ocean of ignorance was the traditional designation. It can be right before you and you can miss it. You can have all the accoutrement and miss it. The ancient saying is, it is so rare to find a teacher who can be there exactly for you that should you miss that opportunity, it might take long geologic ages to come back to that opportunity again. The ocean of samsara dwarfs the Pacific, believe me. All of the galaxies that we can see with the Hubble telescope are but a shoreline of a great crest of matter that itself is but one beach, one lagoon on the ocean of samsara. The language which becomes available in the natural ecology we've seen is a mythic language. It tells storylines. The whole term myth, mythos, a plot line, a development. It has a beginning. It has a development to a certain complication. It has an end. The whole structure of a mythology itself has myths about the beginning, myths about the development, myths about the end. Each myth has that story plot line. A mythology as a whole has that characteristic quality. And so a language which is mythic develops a conditional quality. It must follow a sequence of development. It can have different ways of being told, but it's the storyline that demands that the integration nature of the natural ecology be respected. That the beginning and its developments reach that end. That this story is well told should that happen. But in the functioning of memory, there are stories that can be told that have no beginnings. They have no ends. And they have infinite developments. So that the quality of language that's there in memory would be severely distorted should it be curtailed to a mythic structure. And so the language of memory, of the mnemonic processes, was always a supernatural language. It was extraordinarily, radically different from mythic language. While mythic language delivers experience, a supernatural language presents consciousness. It's this quality that we come to in Vision 5. After looking at Visions 1 through 4, those 4 lectures as a square, Vision 1, 2, 3, 4, just that simple square, which is characteristic of our education. We have a development which flows along, and as it flows along, we can look back. It's called recursive reconnoitering. One looks back, one does a reconnaissance. One recursively makes the form after you have engendered it. But you don't make a form from plan, that would be mythic. But the form is retroactively recognized, so that recognition is a conscious mode of memory. Memory recognizes. And so memory is radically different from imagination. Imagination doesn't recognize. Imagination represents. Imagination represents the world. Imagination represents a very particular phase of the world called existence. And one of the great proofs that nature doesn't exist is that one can hold one's image-making capacity, one's imagination, with such precision as to have it represent exactly what is there in nature, and nothing whatsoever will record. If you're attentive enough at it, the frame of reference of the imaginative picture, the frame will record and it will be empty. For there to be an image, the image is an image of something extant, something that has existence. And we've seen in our education that existence is not primal at all. Nature is primal. But nature is a matrix of change, constantly emerging. What could characterize it is the gerund, the verb emerging. If you put it into a nominal form, one would say nature is a matrix of emergence. And what emerges is existence. And what has emerged and is extant, one can then have an image of that. One can represent that in imagination so that the image has a referent. An image, extant, and natural matrix are part of an ecology that could be characterized by its function, its energy function, which is integration. But that thrust, that current, that tide of integration, though it is mighty, eventually washes ashore, and the last reaches of the waves of integration are shoals in the brain. Every little neural cell in the brain has its little part of that shoal. The axons of one and the dendrites of another neuron don't quite touch. There's a synapse gap in between. And that synapse gap is of indefinite extent. Though it's measurable and one can say how many decimals of a micron that might be, in actual practice, it's of indefinite extent. Each neuron finds itself an island, whose definition are its shoals within a mystery. And were a neuron to try and operate existentially, it would experience a blank, bleak flicker of electronic activity, an electrical impulse that would just quiver within that neural cell and not go anywhere at all. Because the reality is that in order for the brain to work, whole neuronal patterns like thunderstorm clouds have to work together. Otherwise, nothing happens. And so in a very curious way, both East and West archetypally, the image of a creative moment of insight is symbolized by the activity of a thunderstorm. In the great Romantic era of Europe, one frequently had the development of some titanic insight about reality, with lightning coming from a thunderstorm. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is energized, is born from the lightning of a thunderstorm. Benjamin Franklin's discovery of electricity is hanging his house key from a kite to receive the lightning of a thunderstorm. In China, the traditional way, the mnemonic ecology of understanding how the trigrams of the I Ching work is from the simile of a thunderstorm in the mountains. The rising wind, the falling rain, the collecting into a pond, into a lake, the reflection of the mountain in the lake, the realization that the mountain is a part of earth, and that all of this is a part of a great cycle, was the original Chinese pre-Zhou dynasty way of mnemonically remembering the ecology of the symbolic trigrams of the I Ching. It's called the pattern of the former heaven. The pattern of the later heaven was not to remember the trigrams in terms of a natural thunderstorm, but to remember them in terms of the Chinese archetypal family, the mother, the father, the eldest son, the middle son, the youngest son, the eldest daughter, the middle daughter, the youngest daughter. And so this pattern of a later heaven, a latter heaven, of a man-centered world became the way in which the Zhou dynasty symbolized the ecology of the primal symbols of the I Ching. And King Wen and the Duke of Zhou saw the I Ching, the same I Ching that Fu Xi saw, but in a completely different mnemonic. Fu Xi went back to the old Paleolithic. He went back to man living in untamed nature. Fu Xi is the dragon man who doesn't look to things which exist. He doesn't look to things at all. He participates in the mystery, as the dragon does. Lives in the ongoing matrix of change of thunderstorms without end. Old Lao Tzu was a dragon man, whereas Confucius, was a man who looked at the human quality of the I Ching. He used the human mnemonic. He used the family structure. And so when Confucius had his interview with Lao Tzu and came out, he said, "Who can talk to the dragon?" There's no one there to talk with. There's a process of language, but the process of language is not mythic at all. It's magical. It has a conscious, supernatural, transcendent resonance. And one reads the Tao Te Ching, it's like a cascade of unpunctuated language. When I made my translation, I tried to let the 5,300 and some characters just flow. It's just a waterfall. It's a cascade without end. Whereas one looks at the Lun Yu of Confucius, at the Analects of Confucius, they're amenable to being little anecdotes, little quotations. You can even put them on the cookies. Confucius says, you can quote him. It's a different kind of a language. We're looking at a time now where our education needs to respond to a visionary quality of language. And that visionary quality of language is difficult to follow if you're still addicted to the taste of beginning, middle, and end. If you're still expecting images that represent extant things, that you want words which you can pin to existent things which you can tap. If you can't speak unless you have a whole, world of objects to which you can tap them, you're not going to be able to say anything interesting. Because by the time you get around to defining your words by tapping these objects so we can all check out to make sure that you know what you're talking about, we'll long have been bored. So our capacity to hear a supernatural language, a conscious language, needs to free itself. Needs to free itself from representation. The visionary language isn't conditioned by representation. Words in a visionary language do not represent. They don't represent anything else. They present what? They present themselves. So a visionary language is immediate. The requirement of a definition, someone asks you to define your terms, it locates them right away in a very primitive scholasticism that doesn't function very well. The West for 1,000 years tried to function under those limitations. And its greatest triumph was to produce the First Crusade. A holy war. Which the antagonists understood because they got very clearly that, yeah, you guys believe in holy war too. Well, let's fight. And so while the Christian men were fighting the Muslim men, the great estates in Europe were left in the hands of waiting wives. You couldn't leave the estate in the hands of another male, would usurp it. When a lot's at stake, blood runs very thin. Brothers, uncles, sons, usurpation was full-time occupation. And eventually the estates were left in the hands of women. Women who were prepared to run these estates. And so after the First Crusade, for about a generation, there was a little bit of a lull. And in the second generation after the First Crusade, after 1,000 years of scholastic ploddingness, the educational function was in the hands of fairly intelligent women, and they began to change the way in which children were taught. And all of a sudden you find in that second generation, all over Europe, wherever the men were gone, in that second generation, the intelligent women began to school human beings who were tuned to a different quality of language, a language that moved and had its supernatural, its conscious resonance. And so one of the books that we're taking today, Hildegard von Bingen, Hildegard of Bingen, a noble woman who lived over 80 years, who accepted only noble women into her tutelage, but who rose to be an intellectual giant of the 1100s, who rose to be on an equal to the greatest minds of the century in Europe. Her favorite pen pal, St. Bernard of Clairvaux, was one of the great intellectual geniuses of the 12th century, of the 1100s. And she outshone even him. She was probably the most intelligent person in Europe for half a century. She produced music, she produced plays, she produced philosophy, she produced letters. She ran a monastic establishment that became the shining example of a well-run community. But her language is a visionary language. When she needed to, she could write out scholastic arguments as well as anyone. She could use that kind of logic that St. Anselm became the great protagonist of, where you reduce the argumentative flow to its abstract structure, and then you show that your opponent simply cannot follow the structure without going off on tangents of his own, doesn't have the concentrated logical acumen to follow an abstract form. Hildegard could do that. But more than anything else, she is remembered 800 years later for having perfected in her time a completely new visionary language that for the very first time, though it was used initially to train noble women to become monks, not in the worldly ecology, but in the transcendent ecology of consciousness. And so great was her influence that at the end of her life, at the end of her 80 years, this great body of residents came into play into European society in such a way that the returning men taking back the estates after the Second Crusade especially, when success was theirs and they made a Christian Holy Land as an island in the middle of an Islamic landscape. One looks at the Crusader kingdom and one sees the exact outlines of 20th century Israel. They have the exact same boundaries, exact same places, contention over the exact same places. The final contention was over Jerusalem. After, I think, it was the fourth or fifth crusade. It went on, as these kinds of things will do. Because the language that is operative there is a language that has no beginning and has no end, and has an infinite development in between. Because as we will see in our education, that the language of vision, when it matures through the person, people, individuals who come to master that language, become very powerful. The individual person who masters the technique of a conscious language, of a visionary language, becomes as powerful as whole tribes of other kinds of human beings. There are certain individuals who become as powerful as whole nations of tens of millions of other kinds of human beings, because there's no upper end. Someone who masters a visionary language, who masters the differential form of language. Not only masters vision, but vision itself, because it masters the symbolic mind. And the symbolic mind already masters the whole mythic image base, which already can change the way in which existence, in which things happen. Not so complicated. An important individual buys an estate and says all those oak trees will be removed from these hills. They've grown there for 500 years. Gone the next morning. It's as simple as that. It's as complicated and great extent as that. And so the very powerful, conscious individual has tremendous capacities. And of course, the way in which the mystery of the real is set up is that as soon as you have increased capacity, you get increased challenges. And for those who master visionary language and the processes of consciousness, the challenge that comes to them is a new process called history. And history as a differential process is a great challenge. It doesn't matter how supernaturally adept you are. History is daunting. It takes everything that anyone can bring to it to deal with it, because the historical process is on a higher order. History is on a higher order than the person. The person can learn to navigate history, can also master history. But that's a real engagement. That's a real challenge response. That particular engagement was looked at by Arnold Toynbee in the 20th century. He looked at us in a series of volumes called The Study of History. He looked at the challenge response scoreboard and found that mankind, throughout their entire history, has had a number, more than several dozen civilizations. And the civilizations are forms which individuals, conscious individuals, seek to erect on this great ocean of history, and that not a single one of them has survived. That no human population, no genius of powerful person or combinations of powerful persons have ever made a form that has survived the vicissitudes of history. They've all perished. The challenge is still open. Were the historical process to have a voice, it would say, next. Should one despair? Should one give up? Should one kowtow? No. Why? Because the indelible certainty is that beyond the historical ocean of change is another shore. Yet again, that same quality of another shore. That though that synapse gap is really formidable, enormously formidable, it's the accumulated resonance of all the synapse gaps of all the brains that have ever been in any sentient beings in the entire universe. That's quite a gap. Nevertheless, there's still that certainty that's there. Where is that certainty? That certainty does not exist in things. The certainty does not even exist in minds. In ritual comportment of existence, one cannot find it. There's no trace whatsoever. Even in the symbolic mind, you can make the focus and the locus fine enough to a point of vanishing. There's no trace at all. There's not even an expectation. There's nothing. Nada. Shunyata. Nothing. Yet the certainty functions. Where does it function? It functions in a transcendental consciousness. It functions in a form which is better referred to as a prism. That this prismatic, presenting activity has no existence. It has no thusness, has no ritual identification whatsoever, whether in the body or the mind. Nevertheless, continues to function, continues to be a focus and a locus and have a mnemonic resonance, so that memory finds a home. It's as simple as that. There comes to be, after a while, someone that remembers. There is a rememberer. One can't say, well, that body remembers. No. Bodies store images. They don't remember. Minds store symbols. But they don't remember. One can use an asana to illuminate exactly the complete structure of the mind. There's nothing there whatsoever. And yet, in a little while, there is still remembrance happening, still occurring. And in its recognition, recognizes an other shore beyond history. It's not that one has to go. There's no one to go. It's not that one needs to get it clear. There's no one for whom clarity works. Nevertheless, recognition continues to occur, remembrance continues to be effective, and certainty continues in its activity. But not an activity which is natural, an activity which is conscious. And so when we come to our pair of books, because we don't want to use a single book, we don't want to get co-opted into a scholastic exegesis sand trap. We pair books together, and the pair with Hildegard of Bingen is a book by another woman. We keep this gender equanimous because we don't want to have any kind of an indication that, well, we're dealing with a man versus a woman. It has nothing to do with gender whatsoever. And the second book that we're using is called The Art of Memory by the great English woman Frances Yates. The art of memory. That in fact, the art of memory is exactly what began to come back into play towards the end of the life of Hildegard of Bingen. And as the art of memory began to come back into play, the second generation after Hildegard of Bingen, after she died 1179, add 40 years to that, you get about 1220. About 1220, in Europe, you begin having the birth of men and women alike who grow up into lives that become exemplary for remembering many qualities that had been lost for a very long time. If one looks to find examples, a man, a woman, the example of the man would be Roger Bacon, born about 1214, died about 1294. The example of a woman would be someone like Mechthild of Magdeburg, whom you probably haven't heard of, but she was one of the great teachers in her work of Dante. Not a personal teacher, but Dante read a lot of her works very closely, and Dante's Divine Comedy has a lot of her development. She died also in 1294, born about 7 years before Roger Bacon. If you look at the language of Mechthild of Magdeburg, you find a quality of mystical love, which doesn't talk about the body, and it doesn't talk about the mind, but it's a mystical love that talks about the transcendent person. Not a person who has existence, not a person who has a place where a body is, or a focus where a mind is. The body needs a place in order to be, in order to exist. And without the functioning of the coordinates of locus, bodies can't be. In the same way, without focus, minds can't be. Minds without focus can't be. If you follow an asana to focus the mind so sharply that locus itself disappears, the mind itself disappears. No longer occurs at all. Without loci or foci, without locus or focus, body and mind cannot be. But if you transform that combination, instead of an exclusive, mutually exclusive, either or, loci or foci, locus or focus, body or mind, if you bring them together, if they're thrown together into a complementarity, loci et foci, locus and focus, instead of the or, the and, the all-inclusive and, if they're brought into complementarity out of the natural polarity, in nature, body and mind are always polar. They exist, they continue to exist by polarity. But if that polarity is transformed into complementarity, then one gets a transcendent quality occurring, which doesn't have a body, doesn't have a mind, but nevertheless there's a presence. Not a presence that can be pointed to or tapped. It has no referent whatsoever, because its occurrence is non-referential. If one looks to see what are the referents then, what are the referents of a conscious person, the referents become like exclamation marks that go out ahead of it instead of reference that go behind it. So one would symbolize consciousness by arrows going forth rather than by arrows going back. So the conscious person is non-referential, but can make designations, can indicate vectors of further emergence. Along what lines, you ask? Along what structure? Along the geometry of memory, of recognition. And so recognition becomes, the old way in which to talk about it was foresight. One gains foresight. Forehead, because it's the forehead that sees. Foresight. One begins to have this quality of a leading vision, which becomes focusable through a transcendent, non-existent body, non-existent mind form, the prism of the person, which is only there to allow for a spectrum of further possibility to occur. Rays of insight that shine beyond this ocean of ultimate dragons of history and illuminate stones the size of galactic structures on another shore. And there it is. And on any level, the spirit of adventure still obtains. One spirit murmurs to another, let's go and see what that is. Let's take a break. We come back to vision and visionary language. And we need for ourselves to make a differentiation here. The whole second year is based not on integration, but on differentiation. With integration, there are some processes that cannot be participated in, that cannot be done. One needs to have a differential mode in order to carry out. One differentiation that's important is the differentiation between a psychological mode and a visionary mode. And I want to just use a little quotation here. This is a book published a few years ago, 1991, Cornell University Press, The Visionary Mode. It happens to be on biblical prophecy, hermeneutics, and cultural change. Michael Lieb. Lieb, interestingly enough, is a Jungian, and he uses Jung's distinction between psychological and visionary modes for his thesis here in his work from Jung's Psychology and Literature, published in the early 1930s. He quotes Jung, and this is the quotation he uses. The psychological mode makes use of materials characteristic of the conscious life of the individual, including crucial experiences, powerful emotions, suffering, passion, the stuff of human fate in general. Drawing on these materials, the poet raises them from the commonplace to the level of poetic experience, which bestows upon them a universality of conviction and significance. The raw stuff of this kind of creation is derived from the contents of man's consciousness, from his eternally repeated joys and sorrows, but clarified and transfigured by the poet. As engaging as this form of artistic creation might be, its contents always derive from the sphere of conscious human experience, from the psychic foreground of life. For that reason, Jung calls this mode of creation psychological, and its domain is that of the psychologically intelligible. In stark contrast to the psychological mode is the visionary mode. Here all is reversed and unfamiliar indeed, most strange, deriving its existence from the hinterlands of man's mind. It appears to emerge from the abyss of pre-human ages or from a superhuman world of contrasting light and darkness. It is a primordial experience that transcends human understanding, sublime and mysterious in its immensity and shattering impact. It bursts asunder our human standards of value and aesthetic form. Now one can recognize here, if you follow this quotation, that there's a confusion of types here vis-a-vis our education. Nevertheless, a similar differentiating point is made, and that's what we'll use here. The point is that psychology and vision are differentiated, and in a more proper way that is proper to Jung's work and proper to the actuality of it. A psychological mode is always has as its substrate a symbolic base. Psychology is always the study of that phenomenon, quite objective, the objective psyche. which founds itself on symbols. And that the operative mode that allows that foundation to hold up the psyche, the psychological realm, is the very process of integration. Without integration being real, the psyche would not be able to hold itself on a foundation of symbols. Without the psyche being objective, the objective psyche, there is no way in which the form would hold. Different from that, differentiated from that, the visionary mode does not need to have a symbolic basis. The visionary mode very frequently in an experienced hands has a symbolic basis. Or it can have a symbolic basis, but it's not limited to that conditional, whereas the psychological mode is. It's a profound difference. The visionary mode can have a future foundation. It can have a future objective substrate. An objective substrate that doesn't necessarily exist yet. What is the objective substrate for vision? The objective substrate for vision is the objective person. So there's a curious kind of a reversal here. In nature, one looks for a substrate behind one, underneath one, the very word, substrate. But in consciousness, one looks for the substrate ahead of one, above one, ahead of one in time, above one in space, beyond one in time-space. This is why consciousness can be, quote, symbolized by like an arrow. This is why such an activity as intentionality becomes analyzable. A conscious motive is something that draws a person. It has a magnetic quality. Whereas in terms of psychology, the motive is always, quote, causal. It's always at the basis of it. It's already happened. And so the motive, inspiration, is more important to conscious and differential persons than is causality. And in fact, in Jung's work, he made it very clear that synchronicity is a much more deep operating principle for consciousness than is causality. So much so that in terms of a conscious time-space, causality is no longer the fundamental law that it was in integral nature. In a conscious time-space like quantum physics, causality becomes very problematical and is only operative on the basis of probability. What's certain is that it's no longer certain. And this is logically provable. One of the whole impacts of someone like a Niels Bohr or Schrödinger or Heisenberg, who worked with him as students, is the tremendous realizable power of differential conscious thought processes that show that in a conscious time-space continuum, causality is only a probability which, in a syncopation, works either for one or the other, but not for both coordinates. You can have place, but not focus. You can have focus but not place at the same time. Why? Because there is an obviating reality that exceeds the causal certainty of time or focus, time or place. And that's consciousness itself. And so when consciousness is a dimension of space-time, when you have conscious space-time, one then has to work with this differentiating quality, the uncertainty principle, as delivered by Heisenberg. The incredible paradox is delivered by Schrödinger, like in his wave-particle equations, or his Schrödinger's cat within the box. Is he dead or is he alive? Or especially, but most miraculously, in Niels Bohr's own writing. And when we get to science, when we get to the end of our discovery, one of our books is going to be Abraham Pius's great biography of Niels Bohr, which we will pair with Murray Gell-Mann of Caltech, his book on the quark and the jaguar, Adventures in the Simple and the Complex. Nature loves the simple, but consciousness loves the complex. Consciousness can be equally passionate about the complex as nature is about the simple. Mother Nature likes love to be very pure and simple, whereas Father Consciousness likes things to be very complex, filigreed almost to the point of infinity. In fact, let's make it infinity. Why not? We enjoy both parents. We don't have any problem with both parents. And so our wholeness is a wholeness which has all of this at the same time. But it's difficult to learn with all of it at the same time always occurring. And so our education portions it out in the DNA sequence in which it occurs in the evolution of reality. Any kind of a reality that has a time, space, and conscious dimensionality has a development. As we will see, it has a historicity. There's such a thing as a history of consciousness. And it's as simple as the advanced organism having to repeat the stages. What is it? Stephen Jay Gould's famous little book, Ontogeny repeats phylogeny, that the form repeats all the stages that got to it in its development, in its maturation. We are the summation, but we are also the summing up of all the stages that got us here. And there's a deep educational realization here that if you have an education that does this repetition in a fairly short set of duration, like our 2-year period, you have a chance to get the gestalt of the whole much easier than by trying through meditation to remember 30 or 40 or 50 years of life, or 60 or 70 or 80 years of life. If you can do that, that's fine. But this education gives you a chance to have a hunting population of people of like circumstance going through that particular set in very short order. 2 years, very short. Those of you who've been coming for a while realize that the Saturdays occur with such rapidity that you barely have time to let the dust from the previous one settle before the intuition of this one comes forth. And this particular Saturday is about in the 700s in a row for me without a break, in this particular teaching scheme in Los Angeles. I can hardly believe the rapidity. A year to me seems like such a niggling little form that were I an old-fashioned professor, I would give you assignments that would last a year just as a matter of course. I mean, otherwise, how would you have time to learn? Well, you can see how it is. I have to retire pretty soon. Because when it gets into decades flashing by, it becomes unwieldy. It becomes unreasonable. He just gave us 3 10-year assignments in 1 hour. With no degrees. One of the qualities that comes into this is that the body is born out of nature, the mind is born out of myth, out of language, and the person is born out of vision. The person is not an ecstatic thing, doesn't exist as a thing at all. The person has no thingness. Nor is the person a mind. It's not an image in the mind. It's not a symbol in the mind. The person goes through and incorporates a body, and the body is still there. This is my body. But it's not a defining nor limiting factor. And this is my mind. Yeah, it's there, quite objective. But it's not a defining or limiting factor whatsoever. This particular body, this particular mind, are included, but they're included not only as an integrated aggregate, but they're transformable, have been transformed to a penetrating foresight that carries them to an objectivity much beyond their capacity to entertain. Neither the body nor the mind are sufficiently strong to entertain the full presence of the person. So the objectivity of the person needs to have a fourth objectivity in which it can be at home, and that's the cosmos. Because only the objective cosmos is capable of accepting such a protean reality as the spiritual person being objectively real. That's why the cosmos is so dazzlingly, complexly, enormously real. It has to be the home context for uncounted trillions of beings like ourselves. So it's no wonder that it's as it is. Astonishing and astounding, and quite objectively real, and home. All of it, every bit of it, is simply home. It's turf, but in a differential way. Now this morning we talked about how 800 years ago in the West, women became in charge for a couple of generations of the educational process. And there was an immediate change. Immediate in terms of history, many long years of travail for the people who were alive at the time. For instance, a statistic for you. In 1130 AD, 1130 AD, there were only 3 places in the whole of England that women could go to lead a spiritual life. By 1165, 35 years later, there were over 300. Why? Because of the practical concern of providing for a population that had never been provided for. One of the qualities of a millennial of ignorance that made it a dark ages, it's out of fashion to call it dark ages now, but it really was a dark ages. There was no provision for the spiritual maturation of women. There was no special provision whatsoever. Or if it was there, it was de facto because someone had wanted to include it just for completeness' sake. So there were a smattering of places. Whereas by 1165, in the statistical example of England, there were so many places that it was possible for a huge population to be there. And you find then, at around 1165, for the very first time, in England, in that very same kind of locale, you find a concern with, quote, mystical history for the very first time. A mystical history that has, at its archetypal center, a dynamic that has a mysteriously divine king and a consciously mysterious wizard. 1165 is exactly the date that Geoffrey of Monmouth puts out his History of the Kings of England, where the Arthurian mythos for the very first time is formed. For the very first time, you have King Arthur and Merlin as that tandem, that archetypal dynamic, running the engine of transcendental English history. And ever after that, whenever there is an alerting of consciousness to the vicissitudes of the process of history and its challenge, there is a reminder, a recognition, a remembrance of that, and a bringing of it back into play. When Queen Elizabeth I, was quite different from Elizabeth II. When Elizabeth I was determined that England would be the outstanding star of the Renaissance, even though they had a later start from Italy or France or even Germany, she wanted England to shine. And so she got herself in a position where she was the mysterious divine king as a woman, E.R., Elizabeth Rex. And she got her own personal magician, John Dee. John Dee, who was the mathematical genius of the England of the day. He was the Stephen Hawking's of the day. She got him to research and bring back into play the whole Arthurian mythos. And if you look at Elizabethan England, its power is from the visionary symbolism of the Arthurian origins of England, which are back in play again. And because they're back in play in an England that includes an awful lot of France, she looked at France as her turf. She didn't have any problem at all. And a couple of generations later, when the English king was offed by the Civil War, where does a young Charles II go? To hang out. And when he comes back, what does he bring? He brings a French Renaissance enlightenment with him. He says, enough of these Protestant armies that are destroying the beautiful Gothic churches and things. Let's have a new England. Let's have a new cosmos. And in a couple of years, you have a Sir Isaac Newton getting educated. When one understands conscious, differential ecology, history and art, science and vision look like what they are. They're an ecology which is remarkably annealed, the alchemical term is annealed to the ecology of nature. Annealed in the sense that both have gone through simultaneously a distillation process in common, so that they have a common denominator. Though they are distinct from one another, and in fact one goes one way and one goes the other, because they have a distillation process in common, they also work as a complementarity. It's like the two strands of DNA are complementarity. One strand goes exactly the opposite way the other strand goes. It's like the two fish in the Pisces astrological sign. If they swam the same way, you would have a limitation of resonance. But because they swim in opposite directions, when they swim together, the opposites are reconciled. And then you have the possibility of a life form that not only has time-space as a continuum in terms of its dimension, but also conscious time-space. And from the very structure of DNA, one can see that life, conscious life, is endemic to the universe. It occurs, quote, as naturally as one would supernaturally envision. Life simply happens wherever it can, at whatever time it can, as early as it can, as often as it can, as varied as it can. And on one hand, one can say no big deal, and on the other hand, one can say, wow. Who knows what kind of life forms are there in the rest of the solar system? Whether one looks at moons like Europa around Jupiter, which certainly has life forms, or Titan around Saturn, which certainly has life forms, or the planet Uranus, or the satellite Triton of Neptune, all of which have life forms. It's an endemic quality that's there. And not only life forms, but life itself has, mysteriously, the conscious resonance already to unfold, seated, already there. Just like at conception, when that first differentiation of the cells begins to go, the embryo already has its invisible geometry of distribution of those or of that organic matter into the development of the differential body that's going to be there, the mind, the spiritual person. They're already there. And every single instance of this factors back into the cosmos so perfectly that it doesn't leave a trace of discontinuity. One doesn't pick up a cacophony on any instrumentation. The entire electromagnetic spectrum and the entire magnetoelectric spectrum. There's no confusion or cacophony from the introduction of new spiritual psyches into the cosmos. They factor in permanently and eternally at home. And whatever number there needs to be, or variety there needs to be. As Whitman said, not only does Mother Nature favor freedom and variation, but as Brahms said about the same time, it seems that conscious variation is a principle of form in reality. Reality accepts this kind of conscious variation. One would have wished that Whitman and Brahms would have had a chance to have a little chat together. It would have been a hell of a good conversation. It would have been wonderful. They'd have enjoyed a brandy and cigars together and maybe taken a walk. It would have been fantastic. In a differential cosmos, that can happen. That can most certainly happen. Because you could have a 21st century playwright who would write a conversation between Brahms and Whitman and stage it, and it would happen. So when we talk about differentiation being different from integration, integration has certain conditionals which must be observed structurally and strategically, which are no longer necessarily operative in a differential continuum. In a differential continuum, probability outstrips causality. possibility becomes more real than manifestation, than so-called existential actuality. To continue to cling to existential actuality is a neurotic fixation in terms of differential consciousness. Someone is neurotic not because they're behind the times so much, but because they haven't caught up with their own dimensionality. It's like the coordinates that worked in nature fall on their rear and become an X, an unknown in differential consciousness. And it's that unknown that seems like a threat. It's just an askew coordination that no longer has a differential limitation. One has to move up. One has to go to a trigonometric functioning or beyond. There are functioning dimensions now in early 21st century mathematics that are so playful that one can see that sense of humor hardly conveys the miraculous delight of the divine. If we go back 800 years, if we go back to the time of Hildegard of Bingen, when her visions were fresh, she had spiritual voices of the blood. The blood of the body was capable of singing the spirit songs of the person. This particular cassette is called Voice of the Blood. And she has the art to show you objectively her person, her capacity. But a couple of generations later, because not everyone was able to be on whole vision of Hildegard of Bingen, you find a polarization. You find her vision polarized in society at large. European society at large got the resonant impress of Hildegard of Bingen, but it got polarized. So on one hand, you had a very severe asceticism for women, and on the other hand, you had a mystical, spiritual love capacity for women. Exemplified because at the very same time, you have something like this volume here, Anchoritic Spirituality. Ancrin vis. Ancrin is a medieval mispronunciation of ancient. Vis is a primitive mispronunciation of ways. Ancient ways, ancient vis. It's kind of like garbled English because there's not proper differentiation. The enunciation isn't very noble at all. Street jargon level. And so the ancient ways, the Ancrin vis, is a severe rule book by which you will live for your own good. And what you have to watch out for are the pitfalls of love. You must watch out for them. Oh, yes. Another little pamphlet from exactly that same time is called Holy Maidenhood. Exactly at the same time that you have this kind of stringent asceticism trying to present the differential mode but only getting half of it, you have someone like Mechthild of Magdeburg in a work, The Flowing Light of the Godhead. She writes at the beginning, in translation, I have been warned about this book. And this is what I have been told, that unless I had it buried, it would become a prey to fire. And so, as it had been my wont since childhood, being sad, I began to pray. I addressed myself to my beloved and said to him, Lord, behold me afflicted for the sake of your honor. And she goes on to write in beautiful, mystical, love-making terms. The senses in one part have a little dialogue with the soul, and one little vignette of the senses saying, "Lady, if you wish to refresh yourself lovingly, lean over the virgin's breast towards the newborn babe. See and savor how he, the joy of angels, sucks the celestial milk of the eternal virgin." And the soul replies, "That is a childish love, to feed and nurse an infant. I'm an adult fiancé. I wish to follow my betrothed." 700 years ago. It was never published in her time. It wasn't published until the late 20th century. Oh, the Ancrene Wheeze was published and distributed 700 years ago. To be sure. Why? Because it's always weighted towards an integral cycle that favors a mythological language, that favors a ritual comportment, that tries to then govern, because one is moving in a regressive way, the rituals try to govern the mind. So the mind ordering the rituals into an experiential mode that allows for maturation, it works the other way. The rituals make sure that the mind doesn't get too far out of order. And what Jefferson observed about this, his favorite little phrase, was a Latin phrase which meant the earth belongs to the living. Because quite frequently the most powerful authorities become invested in people who are already dead, and you can't get at them to discuss it. And those rules are used for centuries on end. You will do as authorities say. Well, who are those authorities? Oh, well, they lived a long time ago. Jefferson's reply was, the earth belongs to the living. If the living decide to change something, they have every legal right to do so. That presence precedes preemptiveness. And so an education like this evokes the conscious dimension to add to time-space, that our intelligence about love and our presence about our body and our presence about our mind are not only factorable together, but they're weavable together. So that that particular quality is there and mysteriously can present itself. Now, when Hildegard was first writing, that era, sometimes characterized now as the discovery of the individual, 1050 to 1200. And the reason of dating it back to 1050 is that one goes back in this kind of study. This is from the University of Toronto, which has a great medieval studies program. Set up by Anton Maurer about 30 years ago. UT was one of the great places where medieval studies were, in the 20th century, recognized to a point of excellence, studied to a point of really conscious differentiation of really what was going on here. Because before Hildegard, one has an exemplary pair, Heloise and Abelard. And in Heloise and Abelard, one has the first fracture of the male monastic causal conditional that had held unperturbed for about 600, 700 years. It was monolithic. It was uncracked. And Heloise and Abelard are the first indication of not just a tiny crack, but a severe lightning stroke that went through the whole form. And what made it particularly severe was that Abelard was the most sophisticated logical mind in the world at the time. And Heloise was the most brilliant intellectual woman in the world at the time. Only he was a teacher in the male scholastic, monastic priesthood tradition, and she was supposed to be a nun, and yet they fell in love. And one of the curious qualities is that when he was dying, one of Abelard's last letters, they wrote letters to each other, and we still have them, which is why it can be reconstructed. He wrote to her, "My funeral cortege with the body will pass before the gates of your retreat. When my casket comes by, you with your women must rush out and rescue my casket from the entourage and take it inside and make sure that I am buried near you. You must do this for me, because we belong together in eternity." And it was this world with its causal conditioning ignorance that kept us apart, that kept us in polarity. But there's no reason after death for that polarity to obtain. In fact, logically, it doesn't. Hildegard is from that first generation who recognized that there had been some great opening made, and that this world of perfect integration, the scholastic world, had to be looked at again, had to be re-examined from a different perspective, from a perspective of both sides of the split, both sides of the lightning crack. And you look for the origins of the mind-body split, you can look back to Heloise and Abelard. Because if you go to East Asia, if you go to Africa, if you go to South America, there's no mind-body split anywhere, in any of those places. The South American Indians, the Africans, the Chinese, they don't have any problem at all with a mind-body split. What mind-body split? And as a consequence, one has such a thing in the collected letters of Carl Jung, a letter written in the summer of 1942 to another psychoanalyst, that Jung says it's a curious thing, but the Chinese have no subconscious. When a Chinese or an East Asian goes through, or an American Indian goes through psychotherapy, they don't have an unconscious. Oh, is that so? Well, if the unconscious is not even universal enough to cover the planet, if it only occurs in Europe, then what are we doing with our designations? We better put unconscious in parentheses and quotation marks and asterisks and whatever other little notational items we can. Maybe it's not such a hot word. Maybe the word taken from Edward von Hartmann by Jung, which incidentally goes back again to Schiller. Maybe we need to go back to Schiller to find out. Maybe he didn't use it in polarized designational words at all. In fact, we find that Schiller is much too intelligent and mature. He didn't use language like that at all. He used a very conscious, visionary language. His favorite pen pal was Goethe, who wrote to him for decades. Goethe didn't correspond with idiots. And when we get to Schiller, we'll go back and in art, we'll come to Schiller's great On the Aesthetic Education of Man, a series of letters by Schiller to a young man, alerting him to the fantastic complexity of conscious time-space, to the power of the person as a hero in the universe, to the reality of a cosmic destiny of man. This is exactly the way that Schiller was and lived and wrote. One of his poems, Ode to Freedom, mistranslated as Ode to Joy, is the text for Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And when the old Berlin Wall came down, Leonard Bernstein went right there to the very fractured center of Berlin, when the fractured center of Berlin was coming back into a whole again, and directed the Berlin Philharmonic in a rendition of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony out in the open. They made a video of it. You can see the faces of the people on both sides of what was a wall, of what was a split. Their arms around each other, singing along with the symphony. Schiller's words, Ode to Freedom. Because the spiritual person goes beyond joy. Joy turns out to be a visionary consonance of love. But freedom turns out not to be some kind of middling little thing like freedom of choice. It turns out to be consonance in the historical process. Consonance of wholeness in history. Now, on that scale, freedom is really colossal. It's something worth writing about. It's something worth living. But it takes conscious persons who have gone all the way through a whole maturation process to be able to be there, to be able to inhabit and live on that scale, and to communicate this. And already 200 years ago, persons like Jefferson and Schiller were already communicating this quite adequately, very intelligently. They had no problem whatsoever communicating this. What's happened in the last 200 years is a travesty of regression. Hopefully we don't have to continue along those dead ends. There's no need for a language as superior as Schiller's to be in the mouths of demagogues, of a rehashed National Socialist Party. There's no need for the beautiful language of Jefferson to be mulched up and put into little promotional sound bites of gym teachers parading as president. It's absolute inanity. Because in the 200 years since then, there's been a tremendous development that Schiller and Jefferson would have been astounded at and would have said, what an interesting world. Let's explore it. Because men and women now have available to them a scale of differential consciousness that would have staggered with happiness Jefferson and Schiller. And it's just simply there if we live it. It's right there. That's what this education is for, is to get us current to the joyful spectrum that is right here. More next week. Thank you.